Warning, this podcast contains descriptions of murder, torture and abuse. As a result, it may not be suitable for everybody. Aberdeen, Scotland, one of the UK's most luckiest cities due to the number of national lottery wins. Nicknamed the Granite City as it's the biggest granite supplier in the country and was once the oil capital of Europe. But how did this city, described as one of the safest in the UK, witness hometown murders like Chief Inspector Keith Farquharson, who strangled his wife, and Jannnie Donald, the neighbourhood sack murderer, and the unsolved murder of Betty Hadden after a severed forearm was found floating on the Torry foreshore. Big thank you for everybody who voted in our Twitter poll to choose which city we feature in Hometown Murders. Hope you enjoy the result. Aberdeen.
Of the latest mass shooting in America.
This is humanity, if you can call it that, at its worst.
650 murders last year.
Mother, serial killer.
So far, they've unearthed 3 sets of remains.
From the creators of A Brief History podcast, a Need Media production, comes a new weekly true crime podcast. Hometown Murders dives deep into the murky underbelly of your hometown. Subscribe now to Apple Podcasts or anywhere else you listen to your podcast. Retired Police Inspector Keith Farquharson, 60, in August 2019, strangled his wife, 56, Alice. He claimed she died by accident following a struggle in bed. Keith Farquharson, a former traffic officer who retired from the police force in 2010, claimed he had put his hand over her mouth just to stop her screaming. Farquharson had admitted to having affairs with 3 women and said his wife of 33 years, a pupil support assistant at Hazelhead Primary School, did not trust him. Farquharson claimed to the police he initially heard a noise while in the shower that morning, then found his wife lying on the floor in the bedroom. He admitted later to the police that this claim was not true. He claimed that he continued with the lie because he was in a state of shock. He said he felt guilty and did not want his family to know. Police initially treated the death as non-suspicious, but one officer pushed for further inquiries. When a post-mortem examination was carried out, it found that there was suspicion relating to it, and further investigation was carried out. Detective Inspector Gary Winter of the Major Investigation Team said, quote, "On the day of Alice's death, Keith Farquharson deceived paramedics, police officers and his friends, and above all his own family. Following scrutiny of all the circumstances, a murder inquiry was then launched, and Farquharson was later arrested and charged in connection with his wife's death. Alice's children had to sit through days of harrowing evidence in court, as well as having to give evidence themselves. I cannot begin to imagine how difficult this has been, in addition to dealing with the devastating impact this incident has had on their family." End quote. Further investigation found Keith Farquharson had choked Alice after she asked if he still loved her. She had stood by the 60-year-old despite his serial adultery, and he was once demoted at work for sending a sleazy poem to a female officer. He had previously had a plea to be reduced charge of culpable homicide rejected. The couple had 3 grown-up children: chemical engineer Joanna, teacher Sarah, and son Kerr, who was in the RAF. The pair had been married for 33 years, but he had a number of affairs. He had flings with 2 women in 2018 and previously had a relationship with another woman that ended in 2008. His wife Alice subsequently found out. That affair was rekindled the year after apparently he met the woman by chance in a pub. Alice had found he had made frequent internet searches for women, and Farquharson admitted to his wife did not trust him. On the morning of the murder, Farquharson got up to start his shift as a school bus driver, having retired from the police in 2010. As he lay in bed, his wife asked him, "Do you love me?" after he groaned, and she slapped him. Farquharson admitted they had struggled, and he put his hand over her mouth to stop her screaming. Farquharson went on to say, quote, "It was as if she started to choke. I knew something was wrong. When I let go, she rolled off the bed." End quote. He then made a 999 call, but medics were unable to save her. A post-mortem had found she had suffered mechanical asphyxiation. Farquharson later claimed to relatives he discovered strychnine in the bedroom after hearing a noise in the shower. He continued with this lie due to being in shock. He still claimed the death was totally accidental. A pathologist concluded his wife's neck had been compressed and bruises on her face were consistent with gripping. At the trial, prosecutors stated she had been fighting for her life. Farquharson was later convicted at Aberdeen Crown Court and sentenced to 15 years. At this time he's still there. However, there are further contention as it has been revealed that he will still receive his police pension when he does come out of jail. Former details of the poem that had him demoted came to light as another sex scandal the Grampian police force were undergoing, where he sent an obscene poem to a young WPC under his command. He sent it from the internal email system and was sent to a 28-year-old mother. He was then demoted to PC and worked in the traffic department. He was given a non-supervisory role and fined £500. The next hometown murder we're looking at is Jannnie Donald. On the 21st of April 1934 in Urquhart Road, Aberdeen, 8-year-old Helen Priestley was found dead in a sack at the foot of her stairs in a tenement where she lived with her parents. She'd been sexually assaulted and strangled. Police would later solve the case with the help of Professor Sidney Smith, an expert in the then brand new science of forensic medicine. Professor Smith was able to identify unique bacteria from the victim's vomit found in the sack, which he advised would definitely be found at the murder scene. The true killer of the little girl would turn out to be a church-going, well-respected neighbour, Mrs. Jannnie Donald, whose daughter Jean was Helen's playmate. Helen would often tease her friend's mother, calling her names like Coconut, not realising it was festering in Jannnie Donald's mind, causing her to despise the little brunette. On the morning of the murder, the prosecution counsel speculated that Helen had started one of her tirades on the stairs. Jeannie had grabbed her by the shoulder close to her neck, causing Helen to faint. She was unaware that the girl was suffering from a condition that made her lose consciousness easily, and was convinced she had killed her. Jeannie was then dragged the girl into a kitchen and started to cause damage to her vagina with a broom handle to make it look like that she'd been raped. The first blow woke Helen up, screaming the terrified older woman who grabbed her by the neck until she stopped. At this point she had murdered her. Stuffing the body into a jute sack, she stored it in the cupboard under the sink until the early hours, where she dumped it in the hallway, hoping people would believe Helen's death was the work of a sex offender. Bacteria identified by Professor Smith was later found on floor cloths in Jeannie's kitchen. Her trial took place in Edinburgh, as Jannnie Donald was in danger of being lynched in her hometown of Aberdeen. She said not a word to explain her conduct, nor plead guilty to the charge. Her silence may have saved her from the gallows, as she was given a life sentence, of which she serves 10 years in Duke Street Prison, Glasgow. After her release, Jeannie, now abandoned by her husband and child, was given a new identity and moved to England, living to the age of 80. The sack murderer, as she was known, was gruesome enough, but it would seem Jannnie Donald's hatred of little Helen resonated into the very spirit world. It was alleged that a lady in her 80s had said that a week before Helen's murder, she and her friend went to visit a local fortune teller. These two, keen to know if they'd have any boyfriends very soon, but were immediately disappointed when the gypsy told them to go away, as she could not read their fortunes that day. When the girls pressed for a reason, the woman explained, quote, "No, can I read your palms, my dearies, for I've seen a terrible thing in my crystal ball. A wee girl is going to die soon, and all Aberdeen will mourn for her, so away with you, come another day," end quote. It was alleged that the fortune teller was accurately predicted Helen Priestley's murder, further clouding the issue. On the April the 20th, 1934, her mother Agnes sent her out to buy a loaf of bread. When Helen didn't return, Agnes went looking for her. It was later found that Helen had been to the bakery. A friend had seen her heading home with a loaf wrapped in a brown paper. At the time, the police initiated a thorough search, checking cellars and storerooms. It rained heavily that night, and the search was finally called off at midnight. At 5:15 the next morning, Alexander Porter came to collect Helen's father, John, to restart the search. As he entered the building, he spotted a bulging sack lying under the stairs. At a closer look, a child's feet were sticking out of the sack. Helen was still wearing the same dress, blue jumper, black stockings and shoes. Only a beret and navy blue knickers were missing. There was no evidence of rape, but her genitals and rectum had been injured. It was then later confirmed that this was an attempt to make the attack look sexual. The sack was dry, suggesting it had been dumped by one of the building's tenants and not been in the rain the previous night. Investigators soon learnt that the Priestleys were on friendly terms with everybody except the Donalds, who lived below them. The mothers were no longer on speaking terms. The Donalds were also the only ones not to come and see what was going on after Porter discovered the sack. Jannnie Donald, however, said she'd woken up and asked her husband to see what was all knocking about on the doors and shouting. But the more time the police spent talking to her, the more suspicious they became. She said she'd left the flat to go shopping at about 1 o'clock on April the 20th, returning home with some eggs and oranges about 2:15. She met one of her neighbours, Mary Top, outside the building. Mary remembered the meeting but thought it had taken place at 2:30. She also said Jeannie went out of her way to stress she'd come home early from her shopping to iron her daughter's dress. She was unable to say whether Jeannie had come into the building or leaving it when they met. More damningly though, when asked how much she paid for the eggs and oranges, Jeannie gave the prices charged at the market the week before. Hairs from Jeannie's hairbrush, carpet finers and various other articles were sent to the police laboratory. The hairs on the brush matched those found on Helen's body. At this time she was duly arrested. The prosecution maintained Jeannie had for some reason lost her temper with Helen and strangled her. She hid the body and late that night when her husband and daughter was asleep transferred it to the corpse into the sack and dumped it under the stairs. The defence claimed Donald had nothing to do with the murder and that the attacker had been a man who raped the little girl. All the evidence against Jeannie was circumstantial. The last home-time murder we're featuring today is Betty Hadden, an unsolved murder case after a severed forearm was found on the shores of Torry, foreshore. The police recovered the arm and hand and it was examined by police surgeon Dr. Robert Richard, who had also examined the murder body of Helen Priestley in 1934. He deduced from the severed arm that a saw with fine teeth had been used and the direction of the saw had been changed in the process. He predicted that the limb most likely belonged to a female of about 18 years of age who had been alive 3 days earlier. Part of the hand had been eaten by fish and crabs, and this led to the theory that the limb had been in the water for a short time only. On the day of the discovery, uniformed policemen in helmets, waterproofs and rubber boots and wielding grapes, garden forks began scouring the southern foreshore. Tons of rocks, pebbles and seaweed were trapped over in the hunt for clues. In days to come, policemen swapped their regulation headgear for flat caps and resembled inshore fishermen as they took to the water. Detective Superintendent John Westland, who had interviewed the child murderer Jannnie Donald, led the inquiry, and within 4 hours of the arm being discovered, his men had identified the murdered girl. She was named Elizabeth Ann Craig or Hayden, known to her friends as Betty, whose widowed mother lived at 9 Manor Walk in Middlefield district of Aberdeen. She was just a few days short of her 18th birthday. The The early breakthrough, described as brilliant by the local press, was due to the police having taken fingerprints of Betty Hadden. By the stroke of luck, her fingerprints were on file at police headquarters, as she had been arrested on some minor shoplifting offences. The police were able to issue photos to the local press. Betty had a number of Monday jobs: a hotel scullery, a kitchen maid and a restaurant waitress. Though none of these jobs she could hold down for any length of time. Her disappearance sparked off the most prolonged and intensive probe in the city force's history, and was hampered by the reluctance of male associates of the girl to come forward with information. Just 4 months had passed since VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day, which heralded the surrender of Imperial Japan and the end of World War II. In Glasgow, 100 red-haired men were checked as police hunted a gunman who had killed a woman and a boy porter at Pollocksfield East Railway Station. Subsequently, Charles Templeman Brown was sentenced to hang for these crimes, but he was reprieved. He died in a car crash in 1960. Police initiated a search for anybody who had spoken to Betty or had seen her. As information came in, they were able to fit some of the missing pieces of the jigsaw together. On Friday the 7th of December, she'd been in Torry, where she visited relatives. The following Monday, a girl who was about to board a tram in Castle Street spotted her arm in arm with 2 sailors. She recognised Betty from the photograph issued to the public. Around 40 minutes later, she was again seen in Castle Street. This time she was walking with her 4 other girls on the pavement outside the townhouse. It was later established she had not been in their company at all. The police had less luck in tracing a 15-year-old youth seen in a company of 2 separate occasions. The youth had acted as a go-between, carrying a note from Betty to a friend of hers in a city dance hall. Step by step, the police built up a picture of Betty's last movements as she wandered the east end of the city at all hours of the day and night. Her mother last saw her waif-like daughter more than 10 days before the murder hunt had begun, but she wasn't unduly worried by this, as she's not seen for the first time her daughter had left home. During the investigation, Professor Smith came to Aberdeen to conduct the oral examinations of 4th year students at the medical school. This was too good an opportunity for the police to miss. Professor Smith agreed to help police surgeon Dr. Richards in a re-examination of Betty's pitiful remains. It was the first time they worked together since the Urquhart Road murders, which was the last case we discussed this episode. Professor Smith confirmed the finding of Dr. Richards and the forensic experts at Aberdeen University that the arm had been in the water for no more than 24 hours. This meant the limb must have been dumped on the night of Tuesday, 11th December. It was agreed that both a knife and a saw had been used to dismember the arm. The size of the saw and the pressure the killer exerted could be determined from the marks made on the bone from the point at which the bone had splintered. By reconstructing the body's dismemberment, the noted surgeon Sir John Learmonth was able to prove the actual position in which Betty's corpse had been lying when the killer had sawn off her arm. The next step was to see if it was possible to ascertain whether the limb had been dumped in the water at sea or thrown there from the land. An ingenious experiment was carried out by police with the help from marine scientists. The foreleg of a pig was dumped into water at different spots around the estuary, harbour, river to see where it would land. It was the pig's leg from the Torry side that floated ashore to the vicinity of the spot where the gruesome discovery was made on the 12th of December, and the conclusion was Betty's limb had been thrown into the water from the Torry shore. A few days later, Professor Sidney Smith returned to Edinburgh. Detectives were able to narrow down Hadden's movements before her murder. A woman who was a casual acquaintance had met her in Park Street at lunchtime on Tuesday afternoon. Betty had asked her if she knew if she'd get a night's lodgings. She told Betty she didn't, and Betty left, saying that she thought she knew a woman in George Street direction who would put her up. As she walked off, she called out cheerio. The meeting took place 21 hours before elderly Alec King's search for drift was hastily cut short. That evening, Betty was said to have given 3 sailors the glad eye in Market Street. Detectives believe the murder was taking place in Torry in the early hours of the 12th of December, probably between 2 and 5 a.m. Police stepped up their house-to-house search in Old Torry and the surrounding neighbourhood. The house-to-house check discovered brought some welcome humour to a grisly subject. It was said the proud housewives of Old Torry gave their front footsteps an extra scrub and their ornaments an extra dust when they heard of the impending visit by the law. Police who knocked on their doors were invariably offered a cup of tea. The general consensus is that Betty Hadden was murdered and dismembered in Torry and her remains dumped in the channel. Only her forearm was discovered, the rest washed away, eaten and degraded, so will never be found. She probably knew her killer. It is understood that the police did have a subject in mind. However, he died some years later, and this was never announced. Unless further evidence is forthcoming, then it's unlikely this case will ever be solved, and anybody else involved are dying due to the age of the case. If you would like to support the Home Time Murders podcast, please go to our Patreon page. That's patreon.com/Home Time Murders, where you'll see several different tiers of support from just $1 a month through up to $25 that should give you producing credit, a t-shirt, a mug, exclusive content, ad-free and early episodes. Please look now and support in any way you can. Thank you for everybody who's listened to this episode. This episode has been researched, written and hosted by me, Andrew Knight. Sound, music and editing has been provided by Harry Edmondson. Make sure you subscribe to the show anywhere where you listen to your podcast. This allows the episode to be downloaded automatically as soon as it's released. Please reach out to us on the social media. We're at Hometown Murders on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter. We'd love to hear from you. Please support the show by leaving a 5-star rating or a review. It really does help